premiere episode of Mercedes Classics with Pierre Hedary. And today we're going to discuss what the 280SL is, what it means, and what sets it apart from its sibling, the 230SL, the 250SL. We're going to do some road testing, and we're going to experience the 280SL from the perspective of somebody who owns, loves, and drives one. So as you can see behind me, this beautiful little car owned by my friend Ken is making a little bit of a guest appearance. And in order to understand the 280SL, you have to understand its roots and where it came from and what things are like prior to the 280. So Mercedes introduced this body style in 1963. Most of the initial production was allotted towards Europe, so we really didn't get these until '64. And the 230SL was a great car, but it had a 5 main bearing crankshaft, which isn't as strong as the 7 main bearing crank in the 280, and it had rear drum brakes, which were effective, but having rear discs is just better. People like disc brakes, they're more effective. The rear axle ratios between the two cars are also different, with the 280SL using a 3.92 to 1 axle and the 230SL using a 408 to 1 axle. The other thing that most people like about the 280SL is bigger engine, more power. The 280 produces, this is like a matter of opinion, but the DIN horsepower rating on a US market 280SL is 170 horsepower. The 230 made 150 horsepower. However, in European trim, it's often quoted that the 280SL actually made closer to 180 or 190 horsepower thanks to its optimized camshaft and better valve springs and some other minute differences, including the injection pump and no speed relays or no excess fuel management to cope with emissions regulations. So when the 230SL was introduced in 1964, Mercedes was already planning their next round of improvements to the model. In 1967, the 230 was replaced with the 250SL. Now if you look at an early production 250SL, one that has a build date of the first half of 1967, it's going to have more in common with a 230 than it is a 280. If you look at a 250SL from the later half of production, you see that there's the later steering column installed, which is what you'd see on the 280. It has the later wheel covers, and you see that the interior has evolved also. Mercedes finally did introduce the 280SL with the M130.980 engine in 1968. And 1968 production was unique because the seats did not have headrests, at least on US market cars. European cars never had headrests as standard equipment, just so all of you know. The 1969 version of the car gained headrests, but it didn't really gain anything different mechanically. In 1970, a host of improvements, however, were made. One of the biggest changes for 1970 was the inclusion of transistorized ignition, which takes the current load away from the ignition points and actually moves it to a transistorized control unit mounted under the battery. This system made the car a little bit more tractable. I wouldn't say it made it more reliable, but the system is certainly less maintenance intensive than an original point ignition system. In 1971, 280SL production was fairly minimal. These cars are only produced during January and February of 1971, and it's commonly agreed that around 28,500 units were made. However, I've always been doubtful about the accuracy and honesty of Mercedes production records, and I've recorded VIN numbers in the high 28,000 range. There might even be some lurking out there within the 29,000 range. The 280SL did not change much during production. It was generally if you could describe it, it was such an iconic car that Mercedes didn't really see the need to significantly alter anything about the Pagoda design or the driveline at all. Some of the other engines that the body design was tested with included the 6.3 liter M100 V8. However, this prototype was deemed too dangerous to drive, and after excessive testing with the legendary Eric Waxenberger, the car was just deemed too dangerous to put into production. Another prototype was built with the 3.5 liter M116 V8. Today this modification has been immortalized to a degree because the legendary Bob Hatch put two 3.5 liter V8s and two separate Pagodas, one with a 4-speed manual and one with the 4-speed automatic. This design can be replicated easily because the V8 engine bolts right down onto the 113 subframe. Finally, a new thriving aftermarket exists for performance modifications, which include the installation of Mercedes M117 5 and 5.6 liter V8s. These engines with their standalone K-Jetronic systems can be easily installed in a 113, and the 280SL has definitely found a new life with some of these modifications. I really love the way this car drives, so let's go ahead and take it for a ride. Hey everybody, this is the 280SL test drive that you've all been waiting for, and this is a real test drive with a real unrestored 1970 Mercedes 280SL stick shift. And if it looks a little cramped in here, that's because it's a small car. My cameraman is pretty tall too, so you've got two guys who have a combined height of 12 foot 7 inches in this car trying to film it. So if you can see everything on my face, it's probably because there's no other way to shoot. A lot like trying to cram yourself into a tiny little box, but surprisingly it's very comfortable for somebody of my stature. And it's funny because at least this specific car, because the seats are worn in and it's not really a restored car, at least from the inside. I've always felt very comfortable driving it because it sort of fits like an old glove. And you can tell that the transmission is very direct, very smooth. It's been likened sometimes, at least the first gear, to a tractor gear because it's geared so low. But you know, I find this gearbox to be one of the best parts of driving the car. Now, even the automatic transmission in these really isn't that bad if you understand how to set it up right and you get your engine mixture correct. The shifting is much smoother and it doesn't have the same sort of like emotionless feel that a modern automatic gearbox does. The way that the 280SL sort of fits into my life is I bought this car back in 2013 from a friend of mine, actually, because I'd been working on it for 7 years. It's like the story of how every mechanic gets his car and doesn't really think too much about it until the opportunity arises. And so my friend who owned this car put the car up for sale, and we tried to spin it off to a couple of other clients, but really we find that when people are looking at these vehicles, their expectations almost always start off as being too high. And I had this 300 SEL 6.3 that was just awful, and I ended up selling it to another friend of mine. Even though I told him that it wasn't a good idea, he took the bait today. It would have lasted a day on the market. In fact, I would say that it would be gone in a few hours. But back in 2013, when we really, you know, as an automotive, as the classic automotive market was still finding itself again, most consumers at the bottom or mid-range who were looking for these cars expected a perfect car for $40,000, which was just too, you know, it was a little bit too much for them to understand that every single one of these cars is going to have some needs. So here we are today. I got very lucky. Now, before, I guess you could say before I was really hitting my stride in this business, and before I was really even that great of a mechanic, I used to look at these things with this sort of awe that one would look at a Ferrari or a vintage Porsche, and I would go, oh, there we go, there's the pinnacle of automotive existence. And I remember a couple of times coming very close to getting Pagodas, but they were just awful cars that needed everything. A guy offered me a 250SL one time that had been color changed twice and needed a full engine rebuild, and by some miracle this thing was running and driving. And then I found this 230SL in the weeds by a U-Haul dealership in Orlando, and that car got away from me for the overwhelming sum of $6,500. Now that was actually a pretty good car. I could have worked with it, but when I opened my own shop in 2007 and I started servicing this car, I remember one night I was test driving it home. Even though it wasn't running that well, it was later determined that we had an ignition problem. A spell came over me, and I was just like, wow, you know, there's something about this car that no other car has. And I don't know, you could almost consider it to be a very powerful euphoria. And so this car is sort of like my secret spot. When I go driving, I feel like I have a second nature. You could say I have multiple personalities because some of the other classic Mercedes I own have the same effect on me, but this car definitely has the most powerful feel. So just like Enzo Ferrari bestowed the most beautiful car accolade on the Jaguar E-Type, and he bestowed the accolade of somebody else had bestowed the accolade of the people's car in the Volkswagen Beetle, I'm going to give the Pagoda an accolade and nominate it, and specifically the 280SL, specifically as the most memorable car ever built. Now, in the line of Mercedes, I could say, oh, you know, we should nominate the 300SL, or we should nominate the, well, I don't know, the 300 SEL 6.3, but really, I feel that the W113 has such a lasting and powerful impact that anybody who's ridden in this car with me or seen this car is probably going to remember it 30, 40, 50 years from now. And you don't really get cars like that anymore. I mean, sometimes people will think, oh, I have this Koenigsegg and this is a memorable car. Or somebody will say, I have a LaFerrari and this is a memorable car. But, you know, people sell that stuff after like a year or two because it just starts to wear out. This thing is like driving a bank vault or a safe, to use sort of an overused cliche, but it also has this charm that you just don't get with other cars. That just doesn't exist. And it actually raises the profile of its other siblings, because you start looking at a 280SE sedan or a 250 sedan or a 220D even, and you go, wow, this is a lot of similarities to a 280SL. So while you may not be able to afford a 280SL, you could still buy a really nice 220 diesel for $3,000 or $4,000 that'll give you realistic fuel economy and good reliability. You can afford a W108 sedan, which has, in Pierre's world, just as much panache as a 280SL, will probably garner the same amount of attention, if on occasion, not more. And you know, the great travesty about 280SLs these days is they've become assets that people don't use. They're like, oh, this is an investment car. I don't get out and drive it enough. You know, and as a result, auction houses are just awash with these things. You go and there are 5 or 6 Pagodas. 3 of them are 280SLs, and most of them have been either restored questionably or they still need a good amount of work. And it is getting rarer and rarer these days to see somebody who's just out enjoying their car. And that's why I feel like this car has sort of reached a point in its life where there's not... It's not surrounded by a bunch of similar cars. So when you take it out, everybody who sees it goes, oh wow, I've seen one of those at an auction, but never one on the street. Now, as far as values go, people ask me this question a lot. You could pay anywhere from $25,000 to $200,000 for a 280SL. But what is one of these things really worth? Well, in my world, the ideal car isn't a restored car. It's a car you can get in and drive and use and enjoy. And you hear that? A car that you can use and enjoy is really like a $48,000 to $65,000 car these days, depending on what equipment it has and what kind of care it's been given, maybe the colors, maybe the options. But I remember we looked at a car in New Mexico for a friend of mine a while ago, and it was a 4-speed 69 with air conditioning, red with bamboo interior, and the seller was wanting $65,000 and he went down to $58,000. The car needed some paint work, etc., this and that. But at the end of the day, it was a pretty good deal. And I think any original Pagoda that you can use in the $50,000 range is a very reasonable proposition. So anyway, you know, if you're in the market for a classic sports car, or you have always had a hankering for one of these, you shouldn't lose hope and just think that they're $100,000 cars, because they're not. I know $25,000, $30,000, $45,000 is still a lot of money to spend. Believe me, I cannot write a check for that amount right now, or probably anything close to it. But what I can tell you is that these things are getting attainable again as the market softens, unlike, let's say, an Enzo era Ferrari. And unlike an Enzo era Ferrari, there's no $55,000 engine rebuild waiting for you after your next oil change. Sometimes I've had people ask me, especially in my riding career for sports car market, ask me to compare these to other cars of the time, like the Jaguar E-Type or the Aston Martin DB6 or the Porsche 911. And, you know, all those cars are very different. They don't have the same characteristics. Some of them have more of one quality than another. You know, most of them were actually out and out sports cars, but the 280SL really is an elegant, it's about as tough and durable of a sports car as you can get without losing any of the charm and panache of a Grand Tourer. And so really that leads me to say that the 280SL belongs in a class by itself. I'm not saying that it's better than, or maybe I am saying it's better than an Aston Martin or a, I don't know, a comparable Porsche, but how many of those cars do you see? I mean, we know Porsches are very reliable cars, but these things just survive. They're tough, and I think the toughness is really what sets them apart from other cars of the era. Anyway, you know, my closing remark about the 280SL is that it's an amazing car. I hope that all of you get the opportunity to experience one. I'm really a blessed and fortunate person to be able to do this and enjoy this car. And I want all of you to be able to enjoy these experiences with me. So please keep subscribing to our channel. Please keep giving us your feedback, because we'd like to know more about your own Mercedes experience. Please like us and please share us with your friends. Thank you so much, and enjoy driving your own Mercedes.